A 55-year-old music legend leads police on a 90-mile high-speed chase across 2 states, with a shotgun inside his truck. Officers eventually fire at the tires to stop the car. When the driver is pulled out and placed in handcuffs, the man on the ground is not a criminal no one has heard of. It is James Brown, the Godfather of Soul, the same man whose music would later be sampled in thousands of hip-hop songs, and whose performances once redefined rhythm itself. So how did the man who controlled every beat on stage lose control of his own life? Long before the police chase shocked America in 1988, James Brown had already changed the sound of modern music. In 1963, he stepped onto the stage of the Apollo Theater in Harlem and recorded a live album that almost never happened. His label thought a live recording was too risky. Brown paid for much of it himself. When Live at the Apollo was released, it stayed on the charts for 66 consecutive weeks. The album captured something no studio recording could contain, the raw electricity of a James Brown performance. Then came 1965. A 2-minute groove called Papa's Got a Brand New Bag shifted the center of popular music. Instead of melody leading the song, Brown pushed the rhythm forward. The drums snapped harder. The bass repeated hypnotic patterns. The beat itself became the star. Music historians would later call this the birth of funk. Within a few years, Brown became the most explosive performer in America. His shows stretched for hours. He danced until collapsing to his knees, only to rise again seconds later as the band kept pounding the groove. Promoters eventually gave him a name that sounded less like a nickname and more like a warning: the hardest working man in show business. But if James Brown could control an entire stage, an entire band, and even the rhythm of modern music, what was beginning to happen inside the man himself? James Joseph Brown is born on May 3rd, 1933, in Barnwell, South Carolina, during the depths of the Great Depression. For many American families, those years are difficult. For a poor black child in the segregated South, they are something harsher than difficult. They are unstable, unpredictable, and often brutal. Brown's parents separate when he is still very young. Stability disappears early from his life. He eventually ends up in Augusta, Georgia, a place that will shape both his personality and his survival instincts. Augusta in the 1930s is a city divided sharply by race and poverty. Opportunity for black families is limited, and for a boy growing up without consistent parental support, survival requires creativity and toughness. Brown begins working almost as soon as he can walk. He shines shoes on the streets. He picks cotton in nearby fields. He runs errands for local businesses. School becomes secondary to survival. Earning a few coins in a day can mean the difference between eating and going hungry. The environment around him is rough. Many biographers describe the neighborhood where Brown grows up as one of the poorest areas in Augusta. Some of the houses nearby operate on the margins of legality, including places connected to gambling and prostitution. These are the streets where Brown learns early lessons about how quickly life can turn violent. Yet in the middle of that environment, one place offers a different kind of energy: the church. Inside small gospel churches, Brown discovers the emotional power of music. The preacher's voice rises and falls like a rhythm. The congregation answers with claps and shouts. Call and response becomes a language. For the young boy, it is the first time sound feels like power. Brown begins singing in church choirs and local groups. People notice his voice almost immediately. It carries urgency, intensity, and something raw that cannot be taught. But talent alone does not erase the pressures of the streets. As Brown enters his teenage years, the struggle for money becomes more serious. Small jobs no longer feel enough. Temptations appear everywhere. Theft and hustling become common in neighborhoods where opportunity is scarce. Brown drifts toward that world. In 1949, when he is only 16 years old, the turning point arrives. Brown and several friends steal a car during what authorities describe as a robbery attempt. Police catch them quickly. The courts respond harshly. The sentence is severe: 8 to 16 years in prison. For a teenager who has barely begun his life, the punishment feels almost like a permanent ending. Brown is sent to a juvenile detention facility. The environment is strict, controlled, and designed to break habits formed on the outside. For many young prisoners, the place becomes a final step in a downward spiral. But something unusual happens to James Brown inside those walls. Music returns. He begins singing again with other inmates. Small vocal groups form during free time. Gospel songs echo through the halls of the prison facility. The young prisoner who once sang in church now finds that his voice still commands attention, even among hardened teenagers. One person notices him in particular, a young inmate named Bobby Bird. Bird hears something different in Brown's voice, not just talent, but hunger. The two begin performing together in prison gospel groups. A friendship forms that will later become one of the most important partnerships in Brown's career. Music slowly becomes more than a hobby. It becomes an exit strategy. After roughly 3 years, Brown is released early for good behavior. When he walks out of prison in 1952, he carries very little with him. No money, limited education, and a criminal record that will follow him for years. But he also carries something new, a realization that his voice might be the only tool capable of changing his future. The streets of Augusta still look the same. Poverty has not disappeared. Opportunity remains rare. Yet somewhere inside the young man who once faced a 16-year sentence, a new idea begins to form. If survival once required breaking law, could music now become the only legal way out? When James Brown walks out of the detention facility in 1952, the world waiting for him is not welcoming. Augusta still remembers a young man who had been arrested for robbery. A criminal record follows him like a shadow. Many employers refuse to hire him. The few jobs he finds are temporary and poorly paid. But one door remains open: Bobby Bird. The young man Brown met in prison has not forgotten the voice that echoed through the halls during those gospel rehearsals. Bird's family allows Brown to stay with them for a time. More importantly, Bird invites him into a small vocal group that is beginning to perform locally. At first, the music is gospel. The group sings in churches and community gatherings. The songs are spiritual, emotional, and deeply rooted in the call and response traditions Brown learned as a child. But outside the church walls, American music is changing. Rhythm and blues is spreading across radio stations. Young audiences want something louder, something more physical. The group slowly shifts direction. They become the famous Flames. Their early performances are raw and chaotic. Small clubs, local dance halls, bars where the stage is barely large enough for 5 people to stand comfortably. Most nights the crowd is small. Sometimes the band is paid in cash. Sometimes they are paid with nothing more than food and a place to sleep. But James Brown performs every show as if the room were full. He does not stand still behind the microphone. He moves constantly. Sharp footwork, sudden spins, knees dropping to the floor before exploding back upward. Even in those small clubs, Brown behaves like someone performing for thousands. People begin noticing, not just the voice but the intensity. In 1956, the group record a song that will quietly change everything. The track is called Please, Please, Please. The song does not follow the polished structure of pop music at the time. Instead, it builds around emotion. Brown repeats the same phrase again and again, stretching the word please until it almost breaks. Each repetition grows louder, more desperate. The effect on audiences is immediate. The record becomes a hit on the rhythm and blues charts. For the first time in his life, James Brown is no longer surviving day to day. He is traveling, performing, and earning real money from music. Yet success does not soften him. If anything, it sharpens his instincts. Brown begins demanding discipline from everyone around him. Rehearsals become intense. Timing must be perfect. Musicians must watch his signals closely. Even during performances, Brown expects a band to respond instantly to subtle gestures from the stage. This strict control is not just about perfection. It is about fear. Brown has already seen how easily life can collapse. Poverty, prison, rejection. Those experiences leave him with a deep belief that failure cannot be allowed to return. So he works harder than everyone else. Night after night, the touring schedule becomes brutal. Long drives between cities, multiple shows in a single evening, crowded buses, cheap motels. Yet Brown refuses to slow down. During this period, he also develops a theatrical routine that will later become famous around the world. In the middle of performance, After dancing and singing with relentless energy, Brown collapses to his knees, as if he has nothing left. An assistant rushes forward and drapes a cape over his shoulders. The band softens the music. It looks like the show is ending. Then, suddenly, Brown throws the cape aside, runs back to the microphone, and explodes into another verse. The audience screams. The routine becomes a signature moment. Each performance feels less like a concert and more like a dramatic ritual. By the late 1950s, James Brown is no longer just another rhythm and blues singer. He is becoming something more dangerous, a performer who treats every stage like a battlefield, every note like a command, and every show like proof that he will never return to the life he escaped. But when a man builds his entire identity around control and relentless effort, another question slowly begins to rise beneath the rhythm. What happens when the pressure of that control begins pushing back? By the early 1960s, James Brown is no longer simply a rising rhythm and blues performer. He is becoming something much larger, a new kind of stage phenomenon. Touring never stops. Brown performs almost every night, sometimes multiple shows in the same city. Promoters quickly realize that audiences do not come just to hear songs. They come to witness an experience. Brown's concerts feel closer to an explosion than a traditional performance. The band strikes a tight, relentless groove. Horns stab through the rhythm like sharp signals. Brown moves across the stage with astonishing speed. His footwork is precise, almost athletic, while his voice swings between screams, whispers, and commanding shouts. Crowds respond instantly, yet the moment that truly transforms his career arrives in 1963. That year, Brown insists on recording a live concert at the legendary Apollo Theater in Harlem. His record label hesitates. Live albums are considered unpredictable. Studio recordings are safer and easier to control. Brown disagrees. He understands something that the executives do not. His real power is not in the studio. It is in the room, in the direct connection between performer and audience. To make the recording happen, Brown personally covers part of the cost. When Live at the Apollo is released, the impact is immediate. The album captures the intensity of a James Brown concert in a way that no studio recording ever could. The screams of the audience echo through the speakers. The band drives the rhythm forward with relentless precision. The album remains on the charts for 66 weeks. For a live recording in the early 1960s, that achievement is extraordinary. From that moment on, James Brown's career accelerates dramatically. Then comes 1965, a year that quietly reshapes modern music. Brown releases a song titled "Papa's Got a Brand New Bag." At first glance, the record seems simple. The groove is tight and repetitive. The horns punctuate the rhythm in short bursts. Brown's voice moves quickly between phrases, almost like another instrument. But something fundamental has changed. Instead of building a song around melody, Brown builds it around rhythm. The groove becomes the center of gravity. Drums, bass, and guitar lock together in a pattern designed to make the body move. Music historians later described this shift as the birth of funk. The new sound spreads quickly. Within a few years, Brown releases a string of powerful recordings. "I Got You, I Feel Good," "Cold Sweat," "Get Up, I Feel Like Being a Sex Machine." Each song strengthens his reputation as one of the most electrifying performers in America. On stage, his physical endurance becomes legendary. Brown dances until sweat pours down his face. He drops to his knees, collapses dramatically, then springs back to his feet as the band drives the groove forward. Promoters eventually give him a nickname that perfectly captures the spectacle: the hardest working man in show business. Beyond entertainment, Brown's influence expands into culture and politics. In 1968, after the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., many American cities erupt into violence. Boston prepares for riots as tension spreads through the streets. That night, James Brown performs a concert at the Boston Garden that is broadcast live on television. Instead of chaos, thousands of young people gather to watch the show. City officials later credit the broadcast with helping prevent large-scale violence in Boston that evening. Around the same time, Brown releases another powerful statement. "Say it loud, I'm black and I'm proud." The song becomes an anthem of confidence and identity during the civil rights era. For millions of listeners, James Brown is no longer just a musician. He is a symbol, a man who rose from poverty, prison, and segregation to dominate the stage with unstoppable energy. From the outside, the story now looks like a perfect victory. But when a performer builds his empire on discipline, pressure, and absolute control, another tension slowly begins to form beneath the spotlight. And sometimes, the brighter the spotlight becomes, the darker the shadows behind it start to grow. By the early 1970s, James Brown appears to be at the absolute center of American music. His records dominate radio. His tours run almost non-stop, and his influence spreads far beyond soul and rhythm and blues. On stage, everything looks precise and controlled. The band moves as one machine, the rhythm never slips, and Brown commands the entire room with a single gesture. But behind that precision, another reality is quietly forming. Inside Brown's band, discipline gradually transforms into pressure. Rehearsals are intense, sometimes exhausting. Brown expects absolute accuracy from every musician. The groove must never drift. Every horn stab, every drum accent, every bass line must land exactly where he signals. To enforce his control, Brown creates a system that becomes famous among musicians who work with him. Fines. During live performances, he often points at players who make mistakes. A missed note, a delayed entrance, even a moment of hesitation can mean money deducted from a paycheck. Some musicians later explain that they sometimes knew they'd been fined before the show even ended. The signal from Brown's hand was enough. This method produces an incredibly tight band. The rhythm section becomes one of the sharpest in the industry, but it also produces fear. Musicians play with constant tension, watching Brown's movements almost more closely than the sheet music. Over time, several talented players leave the group. Some go on to form their own successful bands. Many of them tell the same story years later. They respected Brown's genius, but the pressure inside his organization was relentless. Brown does not loosen his grip. For him, control equals survival. Every success he has achieved came from pushing harder than everyone else. Poverty taught him that weakness could erase everything overnight, so he keeps tightening the structure around him. During the same period, Brown expands his business empire. He invests in radio stations and music publishing. He launches new record labels and tries to control more of the financial side of the industry. For a time, the strategy works. He becomes one of the most financially successful black entertainers in America. Owning businesses during that era carries symbolic power as well. Brown is not just performing for audiences anymore. He is building an empire. But running that empire adds new pressure. Touring never slows. Some years he performs more than 300 shows. Airports, highways, hotel rooms, and dressing rooms blur into one endless cycle. The schedule leaves little space for rest. People close to Brown begin noticing changes in his mood. Sometimes he is energetic and charismatic. Other times he becomes suspicious, distant, or suddenly angry. Rumors of drug use begin circulating during the late 1970s and early 1980s. Several associates later claim that Brown begins using PCP, a powerful hallucinogenic substance known for causing paranoia and emotional instability. PCP can distort perception and amplify aggression. Whether every story is accurate or not, many people who work around Brown describe similar behavior patterns. He becomes more unpredictable. Conversations can shift quickly from excitement to distrust. The tension begins affecting his personal life as well. Brown marries several times, but many of those relationships end painfully. Some partners later accuse him of violence and intimidation. Police reports appear. Media attention grows. Fans who once saw only the electrifying performer on stage start hearing about disturbing events behind the scenes. At the same time, the music industry itself is evolving. Disco rises, then fades. New forms of pop, rock, and early hip-hop begin taking over the charts. Ironically, many of the rhythms driving those new styles come directly from Brown's own recordings. Producers sample his drum breaks and bass grooves. Younger artists build entire songs around fragments of his sound. The influence remains enormous, but the spotlight begins shifting toward the next generation. Financial problems slowly appear. Some of Brown's investments fail. Lawsuits and disputes over contracts create additional stress. The man who once controlled every detail of his musical world now faces a growing number of situations that he cannot fully manage. The pressure builds year after year. Then, in September 1988, everything erupts in a way that no one expects. One evening, James Brown enters an insurance office building in Augusta, Georgia. According to witnesses, he believes someone has used a private restroom connected to one of his offices. Brown becomes furious. He is carrying a shotgun. Employees inside the building panic as the confrontation escalates. No one is seriously injured, but the situation quickly becomes chaotic. Brown leaves the building and drives away in his truck. Police are already responding to the scene. Officers attempt to stop the vehicle as it moves through Augusta. Brown refuses to pull over. Instead, he accelerates. What follows becomes one of the strangest police chases involving a major celebrity in American history. Patrol cars pursue Brown through the city streets and onto nearby highways. The chase stretches nearly 90 miles, crossing from Georgia into South Carolina. More police units join the pursuit as the situation grows increasingly dangerous. Witnesses later described the surreal image of flashing red and blue lights racing behind the truck of one of the most famous performers in the world. The pursuit continues for more than half an hour. Brown refuses repeated orders to stop. Eventually, officers take drastic action. They begin firing at the tires of his vehicle in an attempt to end the chase safely. The truck finally slows and comes to a halt. Police surround the vehicle and pull the driver from the seat. The man placed in handcuffs is not an unknown suspect. It is James Brown, the Godfather of Soul, the same performer whose music has already shaped generations of musicians. Television cameras soon broadcast the images nationwide. For many viewers, the scene feels almost unreal. The man who once dominated stages across the world now stands surrounded by police officers on the side of a highway. Brown is arrested and charged with multiple offenses connected to the incident. The court eventually sentences him to 6 years in prison. For the second time in his life, James Brown walks through prison gates. But this time the circumstances are entirely different. Decades earlier, he had been a teenager trying to escape poverty in the streets of Augusta. Now he is an international icon whose own decisions have led him back to the same kind of confinement. As the prison doors close again, the legend of James Brown enters its most uncertain chapter. And the question that once felt impossible to imagine now becomes unavoidable. Has the man who once controlled the rhythm of modern music finally lost control of his own life? When James Brown enters prison again in 1988, the moment carries a strange sense of symmetry. Nearly 4 decades earlier, prison had been the place where a troubled teenager first discovered that music could change his future. Now the same walls surround a man who has already changed the sound of modern music itself. But the world outside those walls has moved forward. Inside prison, Brown is no longer just another inmate. Guards, prisoners, and visitors all recognize the name. The Godfather of Soul has returned to the same system he once escaped. The difference now is that the entire world is watching. During his time in prison, Brown spends long hours reflecting on the path that brought him there. The man who once controlled every rehearsal, every stage cue, and every rhythm of his band is suddenly living inside a system where control belongs entirely to someone else. The experience forces a rare pause in a life that had almost never slowed down. Meanwhile, outside prison walls, something unexpected begins happening. Brown's music does not disappear. In fact, it becomes more present than ever. Throughout the late 1980s and early 1990s, hip-hop producers across New York, Los Angeles, and other cities are digging through crates of old records, searching for powerful drum breaks. Over and over, they return to the same source. James Brown, the tight groove from songs like Funky Drummer, Cold Sweat, and Get Up, I Feel Like Being a Sex Machine become the backbone of countless hip-hop tracks. Producers loop his drum patterns. Rappers build entire songs on top of those rhythms. Music historians later estimate that James Brown becomes the most sampled artist in the history of hip-hop. In a strange twist of fate, while Brown is physically absent from the stage, his sound quietly dominates an entirely new generation of music. Young listeners dancing to hip-hop in clubs may not always know where the rhythm began, but the pulse underneath those songs traces back to the same grooves Brown created decades earlier. Eventually, Brown is released from prison after serving a portion of his sentence. When he returns to the public eye, the world looks different. Hip-hop is now the dominant force in youth culture. The artists topping the charts are younger, louder, and often influenced directly by the music Brown once pioneered. Yet something surprising happens when James Brown steps back onto a stage. The energy is still there. He may not move with the same speed he once had in the 1960s, but the rhythm still lives in his body. The voice still carries the same sharp urgency. When the band locks into a groove, the crowd responds immediately. For many fans, the return of James Brown feels less like a comeback and more like a reminder. The sound dominating modern music did not appear from nowhere. It came from somewhere. And that somewhere often begins with James Brown standing at the center of the stage. But the question of redemption is more complicated than a successful concert. The scandals, the prison sentence, and the stories about his personal life have not disappeared. They remain part of the public record. Some fans struggle to separate the music from the controversies. Others see something different. They see a man who rose from poverty, survived prison as a teenager, created an entirely new language of rhythm, and then somehow found himself back in prison again decades later. The arc of his life does not follow a straight line. It rises, falls, and twists in unexpected directions. And as James Brown slowly rebuilds his presence in the world of music, another question begins to emerge. Can the legacy of a cultural pioneer survive the weight of his own mistakes? When James Brown returns to the stage in the years after prison, the energy of the music world has already shifted. Hip-hop dominates youth culture. New pop stars fill the charts. Entire generations of listeners are discovering rhythm through artists who grew up studying Brown's records. Yet something unusual happens when the older performer appears in concert again. The reaction is immediate. Crowds still recognize the sound. The horn strikes sharp accents. The bass locks into the groove. Brown steps forward with the same commanding voice that once shook arenas in the 1960s. His movements are slower now, but the rhythm remains unmistakable. For many younger fans, seeing James Brown live feels like meeting the original source of something they have heard their entire lives. Because by the 1990s, Brown's influence has spread everywhere. Hip-hop producers have already built hundreds of songs around fragments of his recordings. The famous drum break from Funky Drummer becomes one of the most sampled rhythms in modern music. DJs and beatmakers loop his grooves, turning small pieces of Brown's band into the foundation of entire tracks. Music historians later estimate that James Brown's recordings appear in thousands of sampled songs across hip-hop, R&B, and pop. Even performers outside hip-hop openly credit him. Michael Jackson studies Brown's footwork and stage control while developing his own performance style. Prince absorbs Brown's mixture of funk rhythm and theatrical intensity. Countless performers learn how to command a crowd by watching old footage of Brown concerts. The influence spreads far beyond one genre. Yet the final chapter of Brown's life remains complicated. Legal disputes appear around his estate and finances. Questions about business decisions and family conflicts continue following him. The controversies from earlier years never fully disappear. Still, the music itself refuses to fade. When James Brown dies on December 25, 2006, at the age of 73, tributes arrive from every corner of the music world. Artists across generations acknowledge the same truth. Modern rhythm carries his fingerprint. Without the grooves he developed in the 1960s and 1970s, funk might never have taken shape. Without funk, hip-hop might have evolved very differently. Without those rhythms, the sound of popular music across the last half-century would not feel the same. James Brown's life leaves behind a strange contradiction. A man whose personal life often spiraled into chaos, yet whose musical ideas created order inside the rhythm of modern culture. And that contradiction raises one final question about the legacy he left behind. When history remembers James Brown, will it remember the scandals or the sound that changed music forever? James Brown's story does not follow a clean narrative. It begins with a boy growing up in poverty in Augusta, Georgia. A child shining shoes and picking cotton just to survive. A teenager sentenced to years behind prison walls before most people even discover their purpose. Then the same young man walks onto stages and changes the rhythm of modern music. He becomes the Godfather of Soul, the architect of funk, the performer whose energy pushes crowds into something closer to ritual than entertainment. But the same life that produces greatness also carries shadows. Control becomes obsession. Pressure becomes instability. Fame amplifies every weakness already hiding beneath the surface. The man who once commanded every musician in his band eventually finds himself unable to command the direction of his own life. 2 prison sentences frame the arc of his story. The first helps launch his escape from poverty. The second arrives after the world already knows his name. Yet between those 2 moments stands something impossible to ignore: the music. Thousands of songs carry fragments of James Brown's grooves. Generations of performers build their stage presence by studying the way he moved. Entire genres grow from rhythms he helped invent. The contradictions never disappear. James Brown remains both the struggling boy from Augusta and the revolutionary force who reshaped modern music. And perhaps that is the final truth of his story. Sometimes the same fire that creates a legend is also the fire that threatens to burn the man behind it.